This is not just a matter of a simple belief. It is of a decision that is going to affect our worldview, our choices, the relationships we have, how we navigate those. Really, following Jesus should affect every aspect of our entire life. And so the choice to follow is something that each of us at one point must come to a decision. Where do we stand with him? What we believe about him. But it doesn't stop there. It doesn't just stop with that belief, because the choice is a life change on every level. And I want us to hear this. Spiritual growth is expected. Every single one of us. Outlooks should change. Our mission, our purpose should move us towards living a different life and drive our hearts. 30 years ago, when I was a youth pastor, I held this, the one fall, I had a big fall kickoff, and I called it Riot Week. And every night of the week, I had planned all kinds of different outlandish events that was to draw the kids in and grow the group, so that on that very final night, we would then run youth group with the message was being given of Jesus, and really invite people to not only look at their own life, but to consider just becoming part of our group as we would grow towards one another, toward him. Well, one of the events that I put together was a large food fight and a large mud bowl. And so all day I cooked the most gross, random food for games that I came up with. And I talked to a farmer who let us have the fire department come out, and the fire department flooded their entire field for all of the events. So when 60 to 70 kids showed up that night, we all marched out right into the middle of the muck. From flag football to tag with mashed potatoes, where we smashed it in the faces, to raw eggs being crashed on top of the heads. We had ketchup wars, mustards assault, and just honestly so many other gross, disgusting, strange games. And it wasn't long before we were covered from head to toe in mud and food. And we played it. And because we played in it, we tackled one another, we threw one another down, and which led to the free-for-all of seeing really who could get the dirtiest. And yes, the girls participated in this event as well. But what I failed to consider was when it was over. Because everyone was muddy from head to toe, and mud in places and crevices that weren't even exposed. And I had a problem, because we had to not only get them back to church, but they then had to get home. And so in that chilly October night, and it was freezing that night, hoses were brought out and we sprayed everybody down. And we tried to get all of the mud off that we possibly could. And as we all spoke later, there were places of mud and mashed potatoes in our ear canals and everywhere else that you could not even dream of. Now I want you to hold that thought and that picture. In ancient times, men had an education that went up to 6th grade. And upon completing this, some would be asked to come under an apprenticeship of a rabbi, where their education then would go so many more years as they learned everything about not only the scriptures, but the modeled effect of the mentor of the rabbi. And according to the Talmud, becoming a disciple that person would initially carry their bags. They prepared their food to his likings. They provided him with money for his needs. They could never, ever contradict a rabbi in public. They couldn't rule against him in matters of the Torah. And so their obligation initially was to do that of protecting their rabbi. But that said, part of the ordination process was that these chosen students would learn from the great rabbi along with others who wished to continue with the tradition. And so they were required to memorize the entirety of scriptures. And eventually they would even be tested by them to see if they could become a rabbi themselves. That was their goal. It was a vigorous vetting process. But if you were chosen to follow that rabbi, there was a Jewish blessing that would be spoken over you. And it was, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. Well, this meant that you were walking and you were part of your rabbi's life so closely to your mentor, to the one that was instructing you, that wherever they walked, the dust of the path would kick up and begin to cover you. And this would show that you were so close to the rabbi of your instruction. It's really, to me, man, it is just a beautiful picture of following Jesus. Because for each of us, in both of these pictures, the mud bowl and the blessing, they speak of what Jesus does and what is required. All of us were covered at one point. And maybe some of us here today, we're still at that point. We're covered in terrible sin before we came to know Him, before we decided to surrender ourselves. And through then our acceptance of Him, it is as though He pulled out a hose and He sprayed us down from the grime and the dirt and the mud of our life and our experiences that were all exposed. And of course, like the story, there would be places as well that there would be dirt and possibly hidden, and in time, He too would begin to clean those areas. Because Jesus wants us fully clean. So this would be the areas of our attitudes, the areas of our predispositions, our selfishness, self-centeredness, our lack of belief at times, and just so many other things. You see, it's not just about being clean. There's always more. And if His asking us to follow, His call is for each of us to walk so closely that we are covered from the path of which He's leading, of His truth that begins to cover us. You see, the irony of Jesus, who was the greatest rabbi of all time, who became the very Savior of the world, as rabbi called their prospective students who would be, they would only choose those rabbis, the best of the best. They had to be the smartest. They had to be the wittiest. They had to be the most excellent in being able to answer with questions. Jesus didn't do that, because He called the disciples, hear this, who had already failed the rabbi test. They weren't chosen. And most didn't make it past their 6th grade education. And He said to them, take my yoke upon me. Learn from me. Jesus told that. So why did Jesus choose these initial 12? Because He believed that they could be transformed into men like Him and to take His message forward. And yes, He believed in them, and even in all of their human faults, just like us. He saw beyond the tangible of who they were and their predispositions, and still saw where He would call them. And here's the truth, folks. Jesus wants to be your rabbi. He wants to be your teacher, your master. He wants you to be His disciple, His student, and He is calling each of us today toward deeper things of Him and hidden treasures even of faith that He is waiting for us to discover. So let me tell you, it doesn't matter what you are, and it doesn't matter where or where you've been. It doesn't matter what your job is or even your social standing among your peers. It's not about how much scripture you can memorize. Let me tell you, it's not about what you know. It is all about who you follow so you can become like your rabbi, like Jesus. Today we begin a series with this blessing as we begin to unpack for the next several weeks, what does it actually mean to become and act like his disciple? And we're going to discover even through this some of the expectations he has for growth. It is true. Jesus welcomes. It is so true. He welcomes everyone to follow. But he insists we seriously consider, however, the call and the cost of being his student, his disciple. The requirements that he gave 2,000 years ago, they're just the same today. So as we open this morning, we're taken to a scene of a dinner party, and Jesus was invited to that of a Pharisee's home on the Sabbath. And while there, one of the guests was afflicted with a disease. It was a disease that affected his legs, his arms, his face. They were completely swollen. We call this today dropsy. And more than likely, because they were watching Jesus so closely as to what he would do, this was an obvious setup that this man was invited to the banquet because it was the Sabbath, and the guy was afflicted, and Jesus was compassionate. So what would he do? And so looking at the man, then looking at the Pharisee, and then all the guests that sat at this large table, he said, well, let me ask you, is it permitted to heal people on the Sabbath or not? And there was silence. Nobody answered. Probably their eyes dropped down. So he reached over, immediately touched this man, and instantly he was healed of the disease. And the crowd sitting there, they were shocked and they were fuming. Okay, Jesus went on. So which of you doesn't work on the Sabbath, but if your son, or let's even say your cow, falls into a pit, won't you rush to get them out on the Sabbath? The logic, obviously, it's impossible to dispute. If it was allowed to help animals on the Sabbath, how much more would it be to help a human, a creation, a person? The silence was deafening as Jesus continued to push further, because he had noticed in the meantime at this party, such a strange thing anyway, that in attendance they were all jockeying for the very best places of honor to sit, which was at the very head of the table. They wanted to be up as close as possible to the host, because the closer you were in that position, the more important you would have appeared. And also you could listen, you could chime in to all of the conversation and discussion going on because you were of earshot. So everybody wanted to be up there at the head of the table. And so as he told the story, he told a story that would rattle their cages. So he said, when you're invited to a wedding feast, don't attempt to sit at the place of honor. For what if someone far more important than you came and you were required to give a seat to him? This would be far more embarrassing as you were asked and even recognized of the lack of importance. So instead, sit at the lowest place, the end of the table. And so when the host notices where you sit, how wonderful if he sees you and asks you to come on up to this better place. And then you will be honored in front of every one of your guests. So Jesus closed with it, don't exalt yourself. Well, if this wasn't offending enough to those sitting there, because they were all guilty of so many things just from the attitude of healing and their own selfish ambition, he turned to the host. When you're throwing a banquet, don't invite your friends, your relatives. Don't bring the rich neighbors. Instead, bring the poor. Bring in the crippled, the lame, the blind. For at the day of judgment, the resurrection of the righteous, God will reward you for inviting those who could never repay. You see, he's cut to the quick, because the people listed here, they were looked upon in those days as degenerate, those who were either cursed or they just weren't worthy of their time. And so hearing this is where we pick up in this story. In Matthew 14, verse 15. a man sitting at the table with Jesus exclaimed, "What a blessing it will be to attend a banquet of the kingdom of God." And Jesus replied with this story. So a man prepared a great feast, and he set out many invitations. And when the banquet was ready, he sent his servant to tell the guests, "Come, the banquet is ready." But they all began to make excuses. And one said, "Well, I've just bought a field, and I must inspect it. Please excuse me." And another said, "Well, I've just bought 5 pairs of oxen, and I want to go try them out. Please excuse me." And another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." So let's get some context of this story for a minute. In an age way before clocks and timepieces, the date of a banquet was always announced way prior to the actual event. And it was only on that exact day that the time was given. So this meant if you accepted an invitation to a banquet, to a wedding feast, then you kind of kept that day open so that you knew that you could go at any point when they would say, "It's time." Yet the excuses in this story began to come in because they're all different, but they're really the same. With one accord, they flowed. The first 2, they deal with material things that were simply foolish reasons. I mean, only a fool would buy a piece of land and then go and check on it and investigate it. And only a fool would buy 10 oxen and is only interested in testing them after the purchase. And that third man put his family before everything else. And in each case, they condemned themselves with their excuses because it was a thin veil that was hiding the fact that they simply really just didn't want to come. And such excuses are still found today with those who are interested but not ready to commit with the opportunity and when it arrives. And so the servant returned, and he told his master what they said. And the master was furious, and he said, "Go quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame." And after the servant had done this, he reported, "There's still room for more." So his master said, "Go out into the country lanes and behind the hedges and urge anyone you find to come, so that my house will be full. For none of those I first invited will even get the smallest taste of my banquet." Rightfully aggravated at the lack of respect of so many giving excuses to the invitation, what we see here is just this incredibly beautiful picture of God and his love that goes out and a desire to reach for all. Go to the streets, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame to the party. That would have been completely unheard of because these with afflictions were always the misplaced. They were always the outcast. But he went straight to them. You see, nothing would stop the party. And he wanted everybody that possibly could to come in. But there was still room for more. And so the master sent them out to the highways and the byways and hidden places even along the way to compel them to come. Now our version says urge. Urge them to come. Another word is that of compel. And that's a very interesting word here because the master of the feast, the one throwing this extravagant banquet, was determined that anyone who wanted would enjoy what was prepared. And so the word compel in most translations indicates that God's greatest desire is to fill his house. And they needed to be compelled and urged so that they were welcome and so that they were driven there by his love and acceptance. The context of this passage suggests that Jesus was telling this parable to the religious elite, those who considered themselves to be the friends of God and first in line for his favor. That's what the religious elite believed. He's saying to them, though, look, you rejected God and his work. You are rejecting ultimately me as his son. So now he's going to go to others who will respond. And this is a direct affront to them. I mean, this is quite an awkward dinner party, right? Because he's made them all on edge with the things he's saying. And as these stories are building, we're coming to the conclusion which begins to then tie everything together. Because this was all a setup, what was about to happen, and even a larger teaching. Because Jesus was about to clarify in the most profound way that invitations were sent to anyone and everyone. But there is more than just accepting that invitation, because he is about to draw a line. You see, the crowds by this time of Jesus' ministry had grown large. But he looked at them and he wasn't impressed with their enthusiasm, which really speaks to my heart, because the bigger the crowd is not always the better, right? He knew they were not remotely interested in the spiritual things, but they were there for handouts. And so he would purposely, at this point, lay out the cost of discipleship, of following him, in order to thin that crowd down a bit, to see where people stood, to see what they believed, to see how deep they would follow. And this would become, and this is, one of his hardest teachings, because Jesus is about to make it precisely clear that anyone who wants to follow him must put him first, above everything else in our lives. So a large crowd was following Jesus, and he turned around and he said to them, if you want to be my disciple, you must, by comparison, hate everyone else. Your father, your mother, your wife, your children, your brothers, your sisters, yes, even your own life. Otherwise, you cannot be my disciple. And if you do not carry your own cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. Well, first let's note, Jesus speaks of the kind of person who could not be his disciple. The word disciple means a learner. So a disciple is someone who is a student, who is a learner of Jesus, someone who comes under the rabbi. Now note, he had just previously said that coming to God was like what? That of an invitation, which doesn't change anything that we've learned so far. He's just adding here that being a follower, there is far more in expectation that he has for each of our lives and what that looks like. So he delves into family relationships right off the bat. And I mean, you talk about this is kind of shocking. He boldly said that the true disciple, and we need to hear this, comes to him without reservation, setting Jesus above everything else in our lives. He's looking to be the priority of our being faithful and obedient to him. And there is no doubt this is an audacious demand. None before him, the prophets, the apostles, even rabbis, ever asked for such personal devotion and commitment. Even more confounding here initially is that Jesus founded his way on love, not hate, right? So this is kind of disarming here with reading this. Yet he chose to use this strong word to show one thing, that allegiance to Jesus must be number one priority for all of our lives as believers and followers of him. And not an allegiance to everyone or anyone or everything else that matters. Even when it comes to our family, he needs to be number one. This is the mark of a true disciple of Jesus Christ. The world cannot be more important than what we've discovered and what we felt from him. Let's try to make this a little bit more tangible. When my parents came radically to Christ back in the 50s, their transformation was profound. And they began to step back from relationships, just like what an addict does that is determined to stay on the path of sobriety. If they're serious on this, they will cut back from the people that they ran around with so that they're not taken into temptation, so that they're not doing the things that they shouldn't do, or worse, people that would belittle their faith or try to get them to relapse, right? We know this. So when it came to my parents' family, none of their family were spiritual. They weren't religious. They didn't go to church ever. And as they shared the reality of their new life and their new hope in Jesus, their family members mocked them continually. They were made fun of by their brothers, by their sisters, by their nieces and their nephews, and let me tell you, everyone in between. But in this, for them, you see, Jesus was more important than a person's acceptance. And so they had no choice, because they were determined and on fire to grow for him, that they had to step back. Now, they would still show up at family events, but quite honestly, many times that drive home, my mom would cry, sob the entire way home because of the gathering of how awful her family members treated her, and my dad and the kids. You see, it wasn't just them. All the kids were thrown into the same thing. Yet here's the interesting part of the story. They prayed faithfully for their family that mocked them. And it says a lot about their character in that. But something else was taking place. Because they were pursuing Jesus fully, transformation within them began to take place. And as they were leaning into Jesus, beautifully they were becoming more like him, which is his goal for us. And their demeanor was always of grace and always of love, even when to their faces, their family members talked trash. And the most wild thing, really it's wild, in time, miraculously, because my parents stayed consistent with their beliefs, that they never wavered with their love for Jesus, so many of these same family members that had made such terrible fun turned to Jesus after years of sorrow that they had put on my parents. You see, Jesus was more important than them. And being so important, it would involve them carrying their cross. And he's making it clear that the invitation is given to anyone, everyone. But as even in the initial parable, there is more to this than just accepting the invite, folks. There is no doubt. Oh, this horrified the listeners that day. They all knew what a cross meant. It was capital punishment, specifically death. Carrying a cross, there was no fun in that. And in a literal sense, if someone took up his cross, I want you to think about this, they never came back. When you picked up your cross, you went a direction you would never circle back there again. Think about that. It is a one-way journey. Beside this, it is a deeply personal journey. He used the term their cross, his cross. I think I'm going to get into that. Have I said that already there? Yeah. Your own cross. There it is. It's personal. Because Jesus knew that this was how it had to go. The idea is this is for every individual, and one person's cross may not look like another. But we're all called to carry that cross. Come after me, he said. he's making it clear that the one who bore his own cross would follow the same life and pattern of Jesus. Jesus knew that in time he would literally bear his own cross as he walked to death, and so would those who would follow. And if not, he says, what does he say? They cannot be my disciple. Only cross bearers are his disciples. Told you it was a hard teaching, right? Too many times we understate the demands of Jesus when we present the gospel. And we can give the impression that coming to Jesus is only to believe in some facts instead of yielding our lives to him. Because he wants both. He wants our belief and he wants our yielding to him. So don't begin until you count the cost. For who would begin construction of a building without first calculating the cost to see if there's enough money to finish it? Otherwise, you might complete only the foundation before running out of money. And then everyone would laugh at you. And they would say, well, there's the person who started that building and can't afford to finish it. Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down with his counselors to discuss whether his army of 10,000 could defeat 20,000 soldiers marching against him? And if he can't, he'll send a delegation to discuss terms of peace while the enemy is still far away. So you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. So what is he saying? Sit down. Can you afford to follow me? That's what he's saying. Sit down. See, can you afford? The flip side is to refuse me. And in an interesting way, he's really alluding to the idea we all knew through our following that the work of the kingdom is so many times like building. And it's also like that of a battle, because many times each is more costly than what we ever knew of. And we come back to that verse 33, you cannot become my disciple without giving up everything you own. We have a very difficult challenge in understanding and communicating the gospel here because there are two extremes to avoid. We can give people the impression that they have to clean up their lives when they come to Jesus. That's like washing up in the sink before you jump in the shower. He doesn't require that. We can come as filthy and dirty as we are. We also can never give the impression that Jesus, though, won't want to clean up our lives with our cooperation after we come to him, because he's always going to be working on new things in us and leading new things within us. It's so important for every potential disciple to consider the cost of what does it really mean. Because I want to tell you, he's going to ask you to change. Yet those who choose to reject and resist should also count that cost as well. What possible good comes from opposing God? Let me tell you, it costs something to be a disciple of Jesus. It does. It costs even more to reject him. I think it's important to be clear and make an interesting point here. Salvation, I want to be so clear, is open to all who come by faith. All. Discipleship, growing, and becoming what all he desires and longs for is for those who are willing to pay the price, whatever that price may be. So how willing are you? If our singers would come back up. We're going to continue to dig into this series of what it exactly means to be that of a disciple of Jesus. And I hope that through this series that we are encouraged and that we're challenged, because Jesus wants all of us and every single aspect of us. And although at times it may seem like it's the hardest thing that we've ever done throughout my years of even experiencing these trials and the hardships, and honestly, the tests that have been brutal I've always said, where else would I go and who else would I believe? He needs to be more important than anything else, folks, than anyone else. And so my prayer for us, for you, may you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. May you walk so close to him, believe so strongly in him, trust so fully in him that where he leads, where he goes, that we are so close that we pick up the remnants of his transformation in us, his life and his hope with the people that are surrounding us. And even if they're rejecting you, even if they're standing against you, continue to look to him and let him do the work in them. The powerful name, the very powerful work of Jesus has transformed us so far. And he's going to continue to call us deeper. And he's going to call you more fully into him where nothing else holds comparison to the beauty of serving him and being covered in the dust of our rabbi for the fulfillment of his plans. Stand with me. Lord Jesus, thank you. Oh, my goodness, Jesus, this was a hard teaching, and you know what to do with it from here. And so that's all I'm going to ask is you take it from here. You know our own personal stories. You know where we're at. You know the things we're wrestling with. You might even know some of the challenges that are just so hard right now. Oh, Jesus, lead our thoughts to you. Stir within us even a deeper longing for more of you, a deeper hunger to know you more. God, move among us.